Greetings, greenhouse people. I am your host, Bill Calkins, and in an effort to provide this critical information in any way you choose to consume it, we are pleased to offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is Dr. Will Healy, a retired technical manager who spent decades with Ball Seed working with greenhouses of all shapes and sizes and specialties across North America and around the world. Basically, if it's happened in a commercial greenhouse, Will has probably seen it. And this time he's here to share protocols for finishing begonias, that's semperflorens and interspecifics from seed, as part of our Tech on Demand series covering crop culture for key annuals and perennials. From media selection and nutrition to water, light, and temperature, finishing crops requires careful attention to avoid losses and then send high-quality products out the door on time. Will's going to help reduce your risk in this process. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find dozens of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. And Will, welcome back to Tech on Demand. It's great to have you back. Why don't you go ahead and take it away and talk to us about finishing begonias?
Okay, Bill, finishing begonias is probably, everyone thinks, that's easy. We don't have to worry about it. But what I like to do is talk a little bit more about some of the basics. So if you're just getting started, it's probably a good overview. If you've been growing begonias for years, hopefully you're going to learn a few things about the do's and the don'ts and why sometimes it performs, sometimes it doesn't, and what you can do to make a better quality begonia for our consumers. Because at the end of the day, this is about taking inputs, plugs, and turning them into very valuable finished products in various containers. So what we're going to talk about today, of course, are the two different, similar, but kind of different, because Begonias semperflorens have been with us forever, whereas these interspecifics are like the megas, these other dragon wings, these very large, robust begonias, which really have revolutionized the begonia world. We're not going to talk about tuberous begonias because they're really different, or humulus begonias at this time. We'll do that in a later podcast. So let's start out with the best management practices, which is what we really want to talk about. Always plan on planting immediately upon receipt. Do not plan on holding on begonias. Begonias are probably one of the longest term plug crops, so that therefore we really want to make sure that they're going to be pullable when you receive them. So you don't want to have this root-bound plug, because root-bound plugs don't root out. And what you're going to learn in this session is that roots are the critical factor, because you as a grower are going to make all the difference in the world. So let's make sure that you got a nice well-rooted, so that what is well-rooted? Roots at the bottom of the plug, so that when you pull, it pulls that soil up out of the bottom of the plug. What we want to avoid at all costs is root wrapping. As you can see on the plug on the left, where the roots are wrapping around right at the top. How do you do that? How did that happen? Well, that was because they didn't water correctly. Or if you've been holding your plugs, you're not watering correctly, because it happens very fast. And once it starts, they just go round and round and round, and then they pull apart like a spring. And what happens is you're not drying them down to a level 2 and then watering them up to a level 4. To get root wrapping, and Lord knows we've learned how to do that, is you just keep it at kind of a constant 4 all the time, 4, 5, 4, 5. And so the plug goes, the plants, why should I root down? I'm lazy. I'm kind of like a teenager. I'm just going to root around where the water is. So make sure that you dry them down, and then that way you'll have roots all the way to the bottom. So when you're going to go hold those plugs, so sometimes we can't really plant right away. On the case of begonias, you really want to make sure that you're holding them at about 50-degree nights. There is a base temperature at which they don't grow, and that's about 50-ish. And you don't want the day temperatures to go too high, because we're going to talk about diff later on, where the day minus the night temperatures causes this stretch. And you don't have a lot of choices with growth regulators with begonias. So therefore, especially with the interspecifics, which in and by themselves tend to be vigorous, robust, and tend to stretch a lot, you really want to make sure that you're holding them cool. Constant temperature is the best. But if you don't, then try to keep it as cool as possible. Very critical for getting them off the racks, getting them down on the ground, and growing them cool. Let's talk about watering your plugs in before you plant them with a 20-10-20. Time and again, growers don't do this. and consequently they stall out. Remember, you're taking a vigorously growing plug. Hopefully that's what you've purchased. And if you then starve it, it's not going to pop out. In fact, a little while you'll see some really interesting research that was done a number of years ago where the benefit of this. So make sure that you put that 20-10-20. And why 20-10-20? Because in the case of the begonias, you want it to basically, the leaves to stretch, you want it to grow a little bit up, and then that you want it to take off. And that's what the benefit of having the nitrogen and the phosphorus. If you're planting immediately 200 parts per million, before it goes up onto the line for transplanting is the way to do it. Water them in so that you're not planting dry plugs, which is bad. Well-watered plugs is good. If you're machine transplanting, you may have to let them dry a little bit so that they'll come out of the cells, but make sure that you use the 20-10-20, not clear water. If you have to hold them for several days with no fertilizer, so you're just basically setting them out there, and because you can't fertilize them, just sitting there, use a higher rate at 300 parts per million so that you really give them a good smack and get them to really pop once you get them into the ground, because that's what you're trying to do, is get those roots to rapidly go out. Because one of the things that you learn early on is tops up, roots down. So there's a root shoot relationship. So if the shoots don't pop, the roots don't grow. So you really got to get that top and bottom good moving. If you're going to have to hold them for 7 or more days because of a million reasons, let's not get into it, you may probably want to fertilize them with 50 to 75 parts per million, again from 20-10-20, to prevent any fertilizer stress. If you keep putting water on them, you're just leaching all the fertilizer out that's in that soil, and so consequently that they're just not going to perform. And then of course use the 200 parts per million at planting. What do we plant them in? Well, that's the beauty of begonias. How big do you want them is how big the container is. So the bigger the container, the bigger the plants. And so we use a wide range of different containers. But of course, what's really critical is to remember, the bigger the soil volume, the longer the crop time, because it takes longer to get the root mass. So there is that root mass soil volume relationship, because really that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a good solid root system so we can make these plants dance. So let's talk a little bit about crop time. So we've got a lot of different container sizes. We've got small pack sizes. There's a 48-72 count. Those would be early crop time, probably 4 to 6 weeks in the smallest ones, just because they're going to start crowding and then they start growing up, and then just a management problem. They're probably going to be sold green, except later in the season we have high light and very warm conditions, which will tend to unfold faster, and we'll talk about that. And if you're going late in the season, it's probably about 3 to 5 would be weeks would be appropriate. For medium pack size, you probably add 1 to 2 weeks. If you're starting to go into containers, say a 3 or 4.5 inch pot, you're basically a 1 plug per pot and a 1 to 2 additional weeks compared to a medium pack. Whereas if you're going into a 5 to 6 inch, you're going to use 3 to 5 plugs. And remember, every additional multiple plugs starts reducing the crop time because it fills out faster. So if you think about it, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to unfold the leaves till the flowers come out. And you're then trying to use, in a large pot size, you're trying to use the more crop time just to size it up so it looks like you've got something to sell. One of the things that we always have to talk about is what the soil is. What is the media that you're using? And keep in mind that there's a lot of bulking agents. Wood fiber is the bulking agent of the day. It's great material. It reduces your soil costs, especially in large containers. The downside is the retail shelf life, which is really kind of a problem. So you really have to watch out for that retail shelf life issue, where if you get too much filler or bulking material in there, you don't have the water holding capacity. And we don't send our plants out to retail to die. We send them out there to grow and perform for the customer. So it's important that you don't get too much of this bulking agent. 30% seems to be okay. As soon as you start getting above 30%, now you're changing the soil, water holding, nutrient holding capacity, and performance for the consumer and performance at retail starts to get to be a problem. And I saw this a lot this past year, where the product just doesn't last more than 3 to 5 days before it's ready to hit the bin. And that's not a good bin. Always test your soil before you plant. No one takes a shower without sticking their hand in to see if the water's too hot or not. That's why you need to go and check your soil. In the case of begonias, 5 to 6 pH is a good starting point. Tells you you're in good point. Using a 1 to 2, and you want to make sure that there's a little bit of an EC charge in there. 1.5 was a good place, because as soon as you water, it's probably going to leach out anyways. Every year we see this phenomena where everything's planted at the same time, same plugs, blah, 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 blah. And you get this kind of response where some of the plants grow and some of it don't. And what we see time and again is that this is old soil where the starter charge is gone. The wetting agent is no longer there. And so consequently, they just don't perform. So make sure that you use up your soil, especially early in the season where it's so critical. People say, well, what do I do with all that old soil? Big pots. Because big pots are going to be around longer and you can kind of get them growing, but use them to fill up the big pots, especially at the bottom of the pot, to use some of that old soil. So nothing goes to waste, but then it doesn't cause you irreparable problems, which time and again basically cause chaos, because there is no easy way to fix this. Feeding them extra may or may not fix those. So let's go. So let's talk a little bit about what we're trying to do. When we take a plant, this is what the customers are buying. They're buying the top. No one goes and pulls the bottom out except for me, but people are buying the top. What you are doing is you're producing the bottom. And to do that, we really have to be looking at what is our fertilizer to get you the foliage and the flowers, and what is our moisture plan to get the roots. Because as I mentioned earlier, roots are what you are selling. If you have roots, you can basically make that plant dance. You can make it bigger, add more water. You can get it, it can take up more nutrients. You can make it smaller because it's got the roots. If you have to drench, it has the roots take up the plant growth regulator to keep it compact. So if you have a good, strong root system, you can make that plant do what you want it to do. If you don't have a root system, well, I think everyone has experienced that. We don't have to go into that. So let's talk a little bit about this, because moisture probably is our first step in being successful. Remember the saying, fish grow in water, roots grow in air. If you can't get your people out in the greenhouse to actually be able to tell you that, you need to work on that, because that is where the problems start. If you keep that soil constantly wet, you're going to grow fish and you're not going to grow roots. If you make sure that you go through nice wet, dry cycles, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment, then you're going to end up with more roots, which will then allow you to, of course, water and feed the plant and make it dance. So one of the first steps in the water process is after you've got them planted, let's make sure that we got that soil pushed up against that input, that plug. And one of the best ways to do that is, as you notice in this water tunnel, they've got those water nozzles angled so that as that tray passes through, it basically kind of pushes some of the water from both sides to kind of nudge the soil up against it, because there's nothing worse than to have a dibbled hole, the plant in there, and then you end up with an air pocket. The roots cannot root across that air pocket very well or very efficiently. So make sure that you've got those nozzles at an angle, because especially with begonias, the plant basically acts as a giant umbrella, right?
Oh, yeah.
So if you don't have something to kind of moving them in, water in from this side, a little bit from this side, if you're just coming down straight down, guess what happens? You don't end up with any water in the plug itself. And in fact, that's part of the reason why I say water the plugs before you plant them, is so that you're sure that you're not going to end up with dried plugs, because as anyone that has had that experience knows, that is an ugly thing to try to fix, because then you have to flood it. And flooding basically gives you water everywhere, and then you're just growing fish. So let's just briefly talk about water management. You want to make sure that you've got water enough to moisten the soil just below the plugs. Don't drench it in. This is an example of where the bottom of the plug, because that plug is sitting there up at the top of that pot, there's plenty of water around the plug for it to grow. On that first watering, we're not going to saturate it all the way to the bottom of this cell, because there's not any roots there. And what do we know? Roots are going to grow towards air. Water at the top is going to naturally, due to gravity, flow to the bottom. And so what you want to do is draw your roots down, especially when you're doing large containers. The biggest mistake I see time and again is where people have gone in and they planted their big containers and then they flood them in, and then basically they start weighing, 5-6 pounds or more, because they're just so wet. The water is the weight. And so therefore, until you drain the water out of the bottom, which doesn't really happen, you end up with basically an environment where the roots won't root down. And so they basically just hang there. And of course, if you want to have a good Pythium crop, good plants, just keep the bottom wet. Keep that bottom really wet, and because Pythium is a water mold. So therefore, you're going to end up with more water. So make sure that you slowly bring the water down. What we normally like to see is that once you bring them into the greenhouse, water them into a level 3, 4, at best at the bottom. If you don't have your growers picking up and looking underneath that container, you've got a problem because they're not watering correctly. You want to not just lift it up, you want to look underneath to see, do I have water dripping out? Do I have water-free water? Because if you've got a lot of water running underneath, you are too wet, especially after you've placed them into the greenhouse. Once those roots have gotten to the bottom of the container, then you're okay. In this example of levels 1 through 5, notice the root growth. These were all planted at the same time. This was a grower. I don't know how they did it. They had 6 packs. And these plants were all in the same 6-pack.
Wow.
Okay. Took them out. And notice when you get the soil really saturated there at level 5, how many roots do you have at the bottom?
Not much.
None. And even at level 4, not so much. Notice the nice root growth at level 1. Well, that's a little bit, the top is at a level 1, but what's the bottom at? Level 2.
Level 2.
And if you look at the level 2 soil ball, notice it is kind of starting to dry, but the bottom is still nice and wet. Notice those nice roots. So level 2, 3, so that's where you want to be. Little rhyme there helps your growers think of where do we want to be? We want to be at a level 1 or level 2. Okay. Now, comment about begonias. Begonias have this little problem of the leaves will burn due to water. The leaves get warm. So if you go around, good begonia growers touch their plants, especially in the middle of the day. So you walk around and you touch your plants, and if you can feel them warm, they're more than 98 degrees because your body's 98 degrees. So they're over 198 degrees, probably 100, 120. That's not unusual. Begonias will tolerate that. But if you go and put 40, 50 degree water on it, you end up with what we see here, these white spots, these burns. And people say, well, what is that? It must be a spray damage. Well, no, it's not. You basically treated the plants when the leaves were too warm. If you end up with gray plants, because you let them really dry out to a level 2 or maybe a 1, and the leaves on begonias will gray out on you, what you want to do is either shut your curtains, your shade curtains, and then wait till the leaf temperature is at body temperature. Then you can come in water, or just wait till that night and water them in thoroughly that night or first thing the next morning. But don't water them. Don't have that crisis moment where you go, they're all gray, we got to water, because then you're going to end up with this leaf problem. Now, I promised you that we talk a little bit about fertilizing at the time of planting. Bill Argo, many years ago, did a very neat little trial where he looked at no feed. He did just a pre-plant, so basically fertilized the plugs. Then they fertilized the plugs, and they did it at day 14, day 7 and 14, or day 0 after they planted them, pre-plant, and then planted them, fertilized them, then did it on day 7 and 14. Now, I think even blind people pretty much could hear and hear about how if you put on that pre-plant, that is sufficient to get these plants to take off and grow, because you've bought soil that's got a nutrient charge, right? Mm-hmm. So therefore, you got the nutrient charge in there. You're basically ready to go, and you just need to water them and get them to blast out of there. And if you've got the fertilizer in that plug itself, it's going to blast out of the plug into the soil, and it will take off and it'll fill out. And it's just a matter of temperature, which we'll talk about in a minute, to get them to reach anthesis and flowering. What happens when you start feeding them more is they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So then you have to work harder and harder and harder to keep them smaller and smaller and smaller, so they'll fit on the rack and so that they're not all floppy and big. So really rethink your fertilizer program if you have historically had excessively big plants. Remember, if they're a little bit slow, so that for whatever reason they're not feeding, use a little ammonia plus phosphorus based fertilizers like 20-10-20, 17-5-17. There's a million of these out here, but you want something with ammonia and phosphorus, because that it will give you some stretch. That will give you leaf expansion. It will also give you stem stretch. So in the interspecifics, where height can be a problem, you may want to just temper that to a little less phosphorus than usual. But if they seem to be kind of stunting out, give them one shot, stand back, take a deep breath, give them about 3-4 days, and then if you need to do another one, go ahead and do another one. If you have excess leaf expansion, you really have got to be in the pre-plant only program, because that probably says that your soil has a lot of feed in it. Or your soil has a lot of feed in it, so that it's going to take off and grow anyways. If you do need to feed, it's always a little bit is better than a lot, okay? Because you can always do it twice, but you can't do it once and then hope you didn't, and then wish you hadn't. So you're better off doing 7,500 parts per million. Make sure you got your micronutrients in there, and do that about once a week if you feel compelled to do something. Again, wait till they've dried down to level 2. Water them up to a level 4. One of the things that a lot of people don't do that probably would be really improve the consumer success is put some fertilizer on just before they're fed. A lot of people will water their plugs in before, or their finished plants before they send them off to retail. It's probably not a bad idea to put some fertilizer in that water you're putting on, 150, 200 parts per million, so that the plants are ready to grow. Because again, a lot of times they're going to go into retail and all they're going to do is just water. So if you don't use water, if you don't put any fertilizer, after about 4 or 5 days, they look a little peaked, and no one buys plants that look a little dodgy, right?
Nope.
So what do we use? You want something with a little ammonia in it, because the ammonia is less leachable. 15-0-15 sounds like a good plant. It's all nitrate, but you can leach it all out. So using, again, 20-10-20 or one of those formulations would be a good plan. So what about light intensity? These basically, they will tolerate low light intensity, but they do stretch, especially the interspecifics. High light will result in leaf heating. So you've got to be really careful if you've got really high light. Again, as I mentioned, feel them before you water them. You want to have basically, the begonias are a day neutral plant. We're going to talk about this in the course. If you listen to these, there's short days, long days, day neutral. This is a day neutral plant. What that means is that regardless of photoperiod, the plant is going to flower in spite of you. The only thing you can do is abort the flowers. They are axillary lateral flowers, meaning that the first couple nodes have no flowers in them. They just are vegetative. They'll just branch, especially these interspecifics where they get big and bulky. The more traditional semperflorens wax begonias that we deal with that tend to stay roundy-moundy, those don't have as much branching on them. But once you get about 4 or 5 leaves, then you start getting a flower peduncle in every axil all the way up. And so to get early flowering, you just have to unfold those leaves, right, Bill? I mean, yep. And we'll talk about that with temperature. So as you get warmer, higher light, you get warmer leaves, and warmer leaves unfold leaves faster. So high light also keeps them more compact. So really, the more light you can give, the better it is. And realize that you just have to get those leaves to unfold. So let's talk about unfolding the leaves. Some work that was done up in Michigan State a million years ago, because Eric Runkle's not that old, but Matt Blanchard is. No, just kidding. Anyway, so very nice set of work that they did a number of years ago, where they looked at different temperatures and looked at finishing them, how many days does it take to finish them. And average daily temperature is really critical, because average daily temperature dictates rate of leaf unfolding. Because basically you've got if you have to just unfold till that one leaf is unfold to that lateral that has the flower is there, you just have to get to that point where it's unfolded and up comes the flower. Perfect. Okay. There is such a thing called base temperature. And I want to introduce this because a lot of people will grow cold. They'll be very early in the season, they grow cold. As you get closer to that base temperature, growth stops. Boom. As you go away from it, growth is much faster. So you really want to make sure that you stay away from the base temperatures as an average daily temperature and stay more towards up above that. Remember, the fastest growth occurs when the soil temperature is 68 to 72 degrees. And that is really critical because you need to get those roots active and roots growing. And 68, 72 degrees, nice temperature for root growth. Okay, so that's what we want to make sure that we have. Air temperature, we want to keep the air temperature in the same range, and that prevents diff, a high diff, which causes stretch so that we don't have to put growth regulators in, because growth regulators is just one more thing to figure out how to do. So let's try to just keep the temperatures moderate. Remember, if you have really high temperatures, especially as you start later in the season, you get into late May, June, July, and on, basically those very high temperatures promote very soft growth because you put the ammonia out there, you got phosphorus out there, it's wet because you're watering them because it's hot, and you end up with blowing up the plants into really big plants. So there, in that case, if you know you're going to have a lot of high air temperatures, you may want to consider, what's my growth regulator program? So how do we control stretch? Number one, watch out for excess fertilizer to keep the leaves under control. High ammonia and phosphorus fertilizers basically are going to give you leaf and stretch and stem expansion, as we talked earlier. So really try to control that. Look, if you're really concerned and you've got a lot of problems, consider going to a nitrate-based fertilizer. There's no limited ammonia, virtually none, and no phosphorus. So if you don't have the phosphorus and you don't have the ammonia, you're not going to have any stretch. They're going to just get hard toned compact. So if you suffer from a lot of soft growth, consider looking at 14014, 15015, any of those where the middle number is 0 for your control. Remember, diff, the day minus night temperature, is critical because it's your first line of control always when you're looking at trying to control plant stretch. Now, growth regulators. No paclobutazol, no bonsai or any of the other forms of paclobutazol. In this picture, you can clearly see these hard, rocky-looking little plants next to normal ones. This was drift from some begonias nearby, or not begonias, some petunias nearby that they put some bonsai and they had drift on them a little bit. It's a really interesting work that was done probably 15, 20 years ago, where they basically looked at the residual, where they sprayed the inside of some containers and then planted the begonias in them. They never grew. They just hunkered down. You can actually tell them because they're hard and crispy. And that's the effect of bonsai, the paclobutazol. So really stay away from it. It has a very long-term residual, and it's very, very effective at ultra low rates. So what we want to use is to tone them down. So if you have a lot of problems with that, they just seem to kind of take off on you, look at toning them using combination of diaminoxides and chlormequats, or even just ansimidol by itself as a spray. And remember, when you spray, most of these chemicals are effective on the stem, so you need to kind of really spray at an angle so that you're coming into the spray, so you're just not just hitting leaves. So make sure that you get them thoroughly sprayed. Let's finally talk about insects and disease issues. I can't stress enough that you should always be looking over and under the bench. Most of your problems start underneath the bench because that's where you're not looking, okay? If we know a number of the insect problems that we have are related to a life stage that's in the soil, and that soil is under your benches, in your cracks in the concrete, underneath the cloth and into the gravel. So make sure that you're monitoring underneath there. Look for the fungus gnats and shortflies, really common problem on begonias. Treat the plants, look at the plants, check your inbound plants. How you can check them is put them in a plastic bag for a day, and you'll know if you got fungus gnats, shortflies. Thrips can be a problem. They can come up. It's normally not a big problem on begonias, but again, that's in the soil, and you have to manage the pupa stage. Slugs are also another one because people tend to get begonias wet. they'll come in and they'll just munch down on your begonias very nicely, especially because you've got them in packs where there's very high density. If we take a look at the disease risk, the beauty of begonias, one of the only crops that we'll ever talk about this, they're relatively disease free. I mean, if you got a disease on your begonias, you got a lot of other problems going on here. Now, I've seen other problems on begonias where it was too hot, too humid, bacterial problems, but that was only in that one place because they had the wrong environment. If you got a normal environment, botrytis could be a problem. Just watch your relative humidity with the night. Make sure you got night venting. Pythium, if you're just keeping them way too wet, that will do it. So hopefully, Bill, this has given us a quick rundown on what it looks like and what we need to be doing. So take it away.
Well, I think that was a great rundown, concise and very targeted. It sounds like it's not, I don't know, it's tough to screw up a begonia crop, but you really need to pay attention to all these different factors and just make sure they're right, and then you should have success, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So thank you, Will. You can find, and you can see on this slide, dozens, if not hundreds, of Tech on Demand educational resources online. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of technical and cultural topics. We've created videos for growers of all skill levels, training videos. And then we have a podcast, which is a great way to learn about some of these technical topics on the go. Then you can connect with a huge network of more than 6,000 of your peers in the Greenhouse Tech Team group on Facebook. All you got to do is search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a few simple questions, and I will let you right in. But Will, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we're going to talk again soon because there are a lot more crops to cover.
Yep.
And we've got a few already queued up.
Yep.
So I am Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand on behalf of our entire technical team and Dr. Will Healy. Thank you for listening and watching, and take care out there.